Hi everyone, this is Judy, your EJ Strong student intern, and in this video, I will be walking you through how to fill out the disaster risk analysis form. This form is a way to synthesize our findings from the hazard, vulnerability, and capacity forms. So I recommend watching the other 3 videos in the series and completing these 3 forms first before continuing on with the disaster risk analysis form. Here's the blank disaster risk analysis form. There are several components to this form that may seem familiar if you've completed the past assessments. At the top, there's a box for a community profile or a description of the community you will be assessing. Below that, there's a box for a hazard profile or a description of the hazard you will be focusing on for this form. We recommend you only focus on one hazard, such as a fire or a flood, so we can get as specific as possible. Then there are a few columns starting with elements at risk. These are our human and non-human elements that we will be assessing risk for. Degree of risk, which refers to our quantitative counts of our elements at risk based on their proximity to the hazard. Individual survivability capacity gaps, which will refer to anything hampering our elements at risk from surviving a hazard. And community capacity gaps, which refers to collective gaps within a community related to readiness, prevention, and mitigation. To recap these terms, readiness refers to all of the things communities can do to prepare for a hazard before it occurs, such as planning, training, or ensuring infrastructure like early warning systems are in place and operational. Prevention activities look at the root causes of a hazard and aim to prevent the hazard from occurring entirely. This may not apply in the case of something we can't prevent like a hurricane, but human-caused hazards like fires can be prevented in certain ways that I'll get into in just a bit. And mitigation refers to activities that seek to lessen the impact of a hazard that can't otherwise be avoided. At the bottom of the form, there is space to provide a summary of our findings once we've filled out the rest of the form, and a space for recommendations to identify any action items that become clear as we identify capacity gaps. So now let's jump into how to actually fill out this form. Like with our other forms, I will be walking through an example of an urban fire occurring in the North Charleston-Lamsey communities. Starting at the top of the form with our community profile, we have the Lamsey communities in North Charleston, which include Union Heights, Windsor, 5 Mile, Howard Heights, Accoby, Chicora Cherokee, and Liberty Hill. These are historic communities of color that have been around since the Reconstruction era and are important sources of culture and livelihood. These communities face environmental injustices from their proximity to industrial facilities, Superfund sites, and highways, as well as the persistence of contaminants from these sites in the air, water, and soil. Our hazard profile is the same as it was in the vulnerability assessment form. We have a conflagration at the Detjans shipyard at 1670 Dry Dock Ave in North Charleston. This type of fire is not something that occurs very often in the city. However, with the amount of industry that is highly proximate to the Lamsey communities, the potential for a widespread fire persists, including as a secondary hazard to something like an earthquake. It has the potential for affecting the whole community, including the need to evacuate and worsening air quality issues. It would cause widespread destruction to all property, including homes, businesses, and infrastructure. Moving on to our elements at risk, you can go back to the vulnerability assessment form again and copy over what you've already identified as specific vulnerable populations and structures. We'll start with our human elements at risk that we initially identified with the help of EPA's EJ screen. So here we have elderly or those over 65 years old, children or those under 5 years old, those with less than a high school education, linguistically isolated populations, people of color, and those with low incomes. The next part of the form, the degree of risk, also comes from a vulnerability form. We want to carry over the work we've already done, counting up these elements at different distances to the source of the fire, so we can start to make conclusions about overall gaps and things to focus on. So you can copy over these numbers for each human element and for each level of vulnerability, high being less than a half mile from the source of the fire, medium between a half mile and a mile, and low is over 1 mile away. Remember, depending on the hazard you chose to focus on, these distances may not apply or might be entirely different. So for example, something like a pandemic that doesn't have an exact source might not have the distance breakdown. So this is something that is important to think about with each hazard. The rest of our form will summarize our findings from the capacity assessment form. We can combine our findings for gaps in survivability, both before and during a hazard, to fill in our individual survivability capacity gaps column. So now we have the ability to evacuate, disaster awareness, and bilingual communication for our various human elements. For community capacity gaps, we have 3 categories for gaps related to readiness, prevention, and mitigation. Readiness, remember, is all of the things communities can do to prepare for a hazard before it occurs. Based on the capacity assessment we've already done and the individual survivability gaps we've already identified, we can list things here that communities need to prepare for hazards to protect these vulnerable populations well in advance of a hazard event. So for readiness related to human elements, we have availability and knowledge of evacuation routes and shelters, disaster education, means of transportation, early warning systems, emergency drills, economic well-being, and public/private partnerships. Moving on to prevention gaps, these are things communities need to prevent disasters from occurring entirely. For prevention related to human elements in the case of a fire, we have ensure local industries routinely assess fire risk, for example, by conducting annual reviews with the fire marshal or other fire safety experts to prevent harm to human life. Including these types of individuals and experts in the prevention or planning process can connect communities with response personnel and can help guide assessments and identify areas for preparedness and mitigation. And last, for mitigation gaps, remember these are things communities can do to lessen the impact of a hazard that cannot otherwise be prevented. We have firefighting resources and equipment, mutual aid, mobilization of resources, and availability of EMS personnel and ambulances. So next, we will repeat those steps for our non-human elements. The non-human elements at risk that we've previously identified in our vulnerability assessment were housing units, schools, hospitals/clinics, Superfund and hazardous waste sites, electric supply centers, water supply centers, wastewater centers, and essential businesses such as grocery stores, convenience stores, gas stations, pharmacies, and hardware stores. So just like we did for the human elements, we'll copy over our counts by distance to the shipyard for each of these non-human elements back from our vulnerability assessment form here. The individual survivability capacity gaps for non-human elements reflect what each of these elements provides or contains for people during a hazard and include being able to withstand damage, reopening quickly, and in some cases, like our hospitals and essential businesses being able to remain open, as well as preventing contamination for our hazardous waste sites and wastewater center. Moving on to community capacity gaps, for readiness related to our non-human elements, we have disaster education, emergency drills, public/private partnerships, early warning systems, and business continuity plans. Prevention for non-human elements is the same thing as it was for human elements. Ensure local industries routinely assess fire risk to prevent damage to structures, because doing this can prevent disasters to both human and non-human elements. In mitigation for our non-human elements, we have firefighting resources and equipment, fireproof construction, and sprinkler systems. To summarize our findings from this forum, all I've done is recap the most notable trends in our degree of risk columns and how this relates to the elements of risk that we are concerned about. Here we have, while most of the population of human elements at risk falls in the low degree of risk category at over a mile from the shipyard, there are significant populations of elderly, children, those with less than a high school education, people of color, and low income status individuals with a high degree of risk. These groups may have a decreased ability to evacuate in an emergency due to less access to emergency and financial resources. Most non-human elements at risk fall in the low degree of risk category as well, though there are over 300 housing units at high risk, as well as 1 hospital/clinic, 2 Superfund/hazardous waste sites, 1 water supply center, and 2 essential businesses. These indicate a risk of interruption of critical services like water and healthcare, as well as potential contamination from the hazardous sites and damage to people's homes. And last, for recommendations, I've summarized our findings related to community capacity gaps. We have gaps in community readiness that should be addressed include increasing the number of available shelters and communicating the locations of and directions to these shelters to those especially at higher degrees of risk. Disaster education and emergency drills can also increase community readiness and ability to evacuate. Increasing economic well-being and developing public/private partnerships can enhance people's abilities to withstand a fire as well. To prevent this type of hazard, gaps to be addressed include improving early warning systems for both households and commercial areas, and establishing reliable means of transportation for those who may not have personal vehicles. To mitigate an urban fire, gaps to be addressed include increasing firefighting resources, establishing networks of mutual aid among communities to share and mobilize resources, and explore the use of fireproof construction materials and practices to prevent physical damage to structures. And that is how you complete your disaster risk analysis form. Your completed form may look different depending on how you perceive vulnerable populations and gaps in your communities. But this guide should help you start connecting your assessment findings to identifying gaps to focus on in your communities to reduce disaster risk. Thank you.